Hi everyone, Peter Hirschfeld here, Unit Coordinator in ELA from Science and Technology, EDU30002. Just going to do a quick flip to collaborate for Assignment 1, the report, which has a word limit of 2,000 plus or minus 10% with a fairly high weighting of 40%. And it's due 5 p.m. Monday, 15th of April 2019, week 6. So, you're asked to write a report to a fictitious childcare centre. You can name it if you like and be creative, because it's quite nice to have an idea in your mind while you're writing. So you've got to imagine you're employed as a teacher in an education setting where the management's decided to cut back on the inclusion of science in the curriculum. We're asking you to write a professional report to the management that outlines the importance of incorporating and integrating science content, processes and concepts for children aged 0 to 3 years of age. So I've got a specific age group in mind. This report is a way of articulating the values of science, the relevance of science in early childhood and primary education. So obviously primary is not incorporated in 0 to 3 years of age, but we're asking you to think in a longer term. So when you're an early childhood teacher, you would be selling the benefits of science, incorporating science in your childcare centre and how this benefits the students later on as well. So, you're setting them up for lifelong learning. The related learning outcomes from our unit are summarising the critical importance of science content, processes and attitudes in teaching young children, develop and critique explicit and systematic teaching approaches to science and technology appropriate to the content area, which is science, and levels of understanding in the children you teach, and to investigate the categories of science and the content and concepts within them. So these are all sort of big umbrella ideas in our unit that we hope you address in your report. Let's look at the assignment details. So this is not a lot of information in the details here, but it's pretty straightforward, really, once you've got your head around what a report is. And so a report really is like in a business or a university or something, it's a way of explaining or almost selling an idea with evidence to back you up. So we want this to be really professional, and there's a particular way you have to set this out. You have to have these headings 1 to 5, an executive summary, which is really, if you ever look at a report, the executive summary is usually written last, but it's at first when you read it. What it is an absolute, really clear summary of the whole report. And, say somebody could read this and actually know what your report contains. There is a good guide, which I'll show you in a minute, which discusses that, and we'll go into more detail in our live collaborate about this too, and asking your ELA questions on the board. So you have to have an executive summary first. Then you have a table of contents, which I'll show you. An introduction, so you have to introduce the issue, which is your childcare centre, your fictitious childcare centre is going to cut back on science in the curriculum. So, you have to pretend this is real. And then you outline the key aspects of your report, just briefly, in your introduction. And in your introduction, you also include a rationale for why you think science is important in the early years of learning. Then your key points. So it's like a body of an essay, your key points. It's the main ideas you're discussing. So the key points include dot points 1 to 3 in the assignment criteria, which we'll look at in a minute. Then you have a conclusion. So each one of these is a heading, but your conclusion is a short summary of what you've covered in the body of your report, and you have to have recommendations to the management team about how and why science can and should be included in the early childhood curriculum. The recommendations are good in dot points. You have to have them in there. So all of these headings are elaborated on a little bit in this Writing Your Report guide. So click on this when you start thinking about writing your report, and we'll have a little look at it. So here we go into a little more detail. The executive summary, which would be approximately 250 words. And I'm just catching myself in this little window down there. I look a bit hazy and a little bit like the Bride of Frankenstein. Sorry about that. Sorry, I digress. So your executive summary, approximately 250 words, very brief, quick overview or synopsis of your report, summarising the essential parts. So it will outline the following information: the purpose of your report, so why science is important in the curriculum and why the childcare centre should not cut back on it, an outline of the main content of the report with examples and your academic sources to support your statements, which are the methods. It's the same thing. So most reports have methods. So your methods for research are really the academic examples, drawn mainly, I would imagine, from our readings and other readings if you have done Discovering Science or Teaching Science and Technology, or there's other wonderful things that might support what you're discussing in that you've studied at Swinburne. But yeah, our readings are really good for this. So, and then you also, in your executive summary, include what your conclusions are. Very brief, 1 or 2 sentences about that, and a brief outline of the recommendations, not all of them. So it's just an absolute, it's like a snapshot of your report, what it contains. So if somebody was really lazy, they could read the executive summary and they would know actually what your report is about and what the conclusions are. So it says here, like I said before, it's usually written last. So this allows you to summarise all the major areas of your report, get your report together, write it, and then you've got the essence to go back and write from your report. So people who read only the executive summary should get the idea of the document without all the details. Your report will be addressed to management in an educational setting, so it won't necessarily use language like results, and your method will be how you went about gathering your findings, what sources you use, so the academic resources from our unit or other units, the Australian curriculum, the Early Years Learning Framework, they'll be your sources. And here's an example of an executive summary for you to look at later. So this is not about science, but it will give you an idea of the kind of language you use and what an executive summary contains. We go into the contents. So you set your contents page out like you'd see in a book. So you have introduction, page 1, key points, page 2, etc. It might not be on page, you might have more than one on one page given it's only 2,000 words. You don't have any extra details, just subheadings like this where we have our key points. Our key points are the science content areas from the Australian curriculum and your conclusion. So you can see how you might set out your contents page, which will only be 10 to 15 words. Then you have your introduction. This is different to your executive summary. So it has all the key aspects of your report, like an introduction in an essay. So you include your rationale about the importance of teaching science in early years education. it gives you a little more detail. I won't read this all out to you. You can all have a look at this. But it does give the context of the report and the purpose of the report here. And there's an example of a report introduction, which again is not about science education, but it will give you a good idea. Then you have your key points. So remember, you have to have all these headings in there. And this is the main crux of your report. It's about 1,250 words. So you look at the key points, or points 1 to 3 in the assignment criteria. So assignment criteria point 1 is the summary of importance of teaching science content, processes and attitudes. And so you'll look at the word content refers to the body of knowledge and information that we teachers teach the students and what they're expected to learn in a given subject area, in this case science. And it would be biology, chemistry, physics, earth and space sciences, as in the Australian curriculum. Dot point 2, I'll actually explain. So that's science content. Processes are, my understanding of the term processes, it's in relation to this assignment, are the steps and strategies that children use in their learning, like observing, collecting, noticing, classifying, sorting. And attitudes are like your personal dispositions that you want children to develop. So that would be creative thinking or persistence, wonder, curiosity, problem solving, things like that. So criteria 1 would contain kind of all those things. Criteria 2 that you have to address in your writing is inclusion and explanation of at least 2 science categories from the Australian curriculum. So biology, chemistry, physics and earth and space sciences. Now, just take note that physical sciences are not covered until week 7 in our unit, so we don't expect you to read ahead, and you don't need to include that. But when you do, you need to include at least 2 of the science areas from the Australian curriculum in your report for analysis and explanation and linking to why they're beneficial for children to learn. You might only use 2, but you would say this report looks at 2 of the 4 science categories from the Australian curriculum and uses them as examples to support the promotion of science inclusion in the early childhood setting. So when you think about, say, biological science, and the conceptual understanding for that would be something like, all living things have different needs, or animals adapt to their surroundings. They're the kind of concepts you would learn about in biology. And dot point, so those 2 areas, when we look at them later on, I hope I feel like I'm confusing you, can be combined. So there's no one way to do this, and sometimes they link together quite well in your discussion. And criteria 3 is where you display your understanding of the early years learning framework and the Australian curriculum and link it to the learning outcomes and areas of science. So you make connections between the curriculum documents, the conceptual understandings of biology, chemistry, etc., and also draw on readings. For instance, this biology activity, because you will use examples, very brief, not lesson plans, to support why it would be good for your early childhood setting to have activities like this. So you support it with the curriculum documents and broader contexts. Then you have your conclusion and you tie it all up together, including your recommendations. So this is an essential element of your report. You need to have a conclusion. Your recommendations can be in dot point form or numbered. you can have a good look at this year, and you also have to have a reference list. That's not included in the word count. Now, I'm going to click out of this, and we'll have a look at the assignment criteria, which is kind of what I went through then. So here are these dot points I was talking about. So 1 and 2, these two things you can actually combine. You can kind of weave your response together and include elements of both of these, but you do need to address both things. So the summary of the importance of teaching science content, processes and attitudes. So why is it important? What processes and attitudes will it help develop and promote for young children? 2, so the inclusion and explanation of at least 2 of the science categories: biology, chemistry, physics, earth and space sciences. Remember, these are from the Australian curriculum. So from week 3 onwards, our modules look at the Australian curriculum and go into detail in each of these categories. So you'll get a lot of your supporting academic resources from here too. So dot point 3 is how science is described in the Australian curriculum and early years learning framework. So it's really important you don't just think of 0 to 3, even though your report's directed at an early childhood centre. You need to explain why in these early years science education supports young children's learning, and it flows on to primary and secondary school. And so that's where the Australian curriculum comes in. So you've got your criteria down here. So you have a summary of the importance of science content, processes and attitudes. You need to really make sure you understand the difference between processes and attitudes, and do discuss them in your report. Inclusion and explanation of at least 2 science categories: biology, chemistry, physics and earth and space sciences, with examples of relevant conceptual understandings and learning for infants and toddlers. So your examples might be a little activity that they might do to support one of these areas, and what are the benefits of this activity and how it can link to things later on. And how science is described in the Australian curriculum, early years and early years learning framework. And then we get on to depth and breadth. So depth and breadth. Breadth is how wide your discussion is. So, the top kind of topics you're discussing. And depth is how far you go into each discussion. So you could have a very broad discussion when you touch on many facets of a topic, but you really need to be able to delve a little more deeply into some parts. Likewise, if you concentrate too heavily on one aspect of a topic, you might miss out on other important parts of the topic. So it needs to be balanced and backed up by references. Now, in this bit, if you look just for the pass criteria here, you have to have recommendations included in your report. So just a few dot points, what you recommend that management do to maintain science in the curriculum. And these need to be drawn from the body of your report in some way. You can't introduce new ideas that you haven't actually discussed. It might be as simple as have a variety of hands-on play areas, magnifying glasses and sand and water play areas to encourage earth and space sciences or chemical science investigation. And academic expression, as always, it's really important that you proofread. So no matter how great the content is in your report, if it's poorly written and there's lots of spelling errors and punctuation errors, and it's maybe unfair, it's only worth 10%, but we do make value judgments on that because it does make it a lot harder to read. So make sure you proofread it, read it out aloud, make sure it makes sense. And also, studiosity is a really good one for this. It's good for reports and it's good for essays. So you now, as of this teaching period, to ensure everyone gets equal access to the draft essays service, Studiosity, you now have 2 submissions per unit per TP. I would use this for this one because this is the most kind of academic style writing. Now, whilst it doesn't help you with the content, it will look at spelling, grammar and things like that. It might not pick up every spelling error or choice of language, but it will give you suggestions on how you can make improvements. You need to make sure you do submit this in advance to avoid time constraints. And you get feedback about 1 page for this. So it gives you some in-text notes as well. In summary, I want you to think about the conceptual understandings. So that's when you're thinking about moving children from their present knowledge of broad concepts to deeper understanding. So this is where you look at the early years learning framework and Australian curriculum documents. You link your science categories like biology to activities that develop these concepts, the conceptual understanding of what the children will gain as a result of participating in them. So you're promoting this, you're selling it to the childcare centre. For instance, when children are investigating plants and growth, and you're looking at biology, they'll develop many skills such as observing and classifying, as well as discovering that living things have needs. So you've got your concepts and you've got some skills there. This will lead to a deeper appreciation of biology and pave the way for future learning. Make sure your discussion's linked to the EYLF or the Australian curriculum documents and is referenced correctly. Make sure you don't use too many direct quotes from these documents and paraphrase where possible, or even from your other academic references. And you can even make links to cross-curricular concepts like maths, English, art, like counting and observing patterns. There's so many benefits of science. It's great. So remember, your key points, so looking at the different science areas, and they're referred to as science categories. Then link them to what concepts children would develop through inclusion of science in the curriculum at your early childhood centre that you're submitting your report to. So also look at the bigger picture and how these skills and processes involved through learning science. Remember, we're talking about science all the time. Go back to the purpose of the report, that paves the way for future learning and equips children with essential skills for everyday life. Okay, so hopefully you'll come armed to the live collaborate with some good questions about this. So it'll be fantastic if you could have a think about how you're going to set it out, because that's when you'll have your questions. And think about that before the live collaborate, and we'll try to answer as many questions as you can, and go through some of this again with some other ideas. We'll do a bit of brainstorming and think about why you really do believe it is important to have science in an early childhood setting, and imagine if they didn't do it. What would the kids be missing out on? Why do you think personally it's important? Then look at our modules and get your some other resources and support your ideas. All right. Thanks everyone, and good luck with the assignment. See you at the live collaborate.